Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. My name is Nick Soberall. I'm a member of the NERRS Science Collaborative staff. We're glad you can join us today for this webinar on mapping the effects of long-term hydrologic stress, sea level rise, and Hurricane Irma on coastal habitats in Southwest Florida with Matt McCarthy and Brita Jessen. Matt and Brita have been collaborating on a one-year catalyst project that has relevance to coastal land managers interested in mapping habitat change. This webinar will describe the use of advanced satellite imagery to map the damage, death, and recovery of mangroves with a time series of images from 2010 to 2018. The webinar today is part of a monthly webinar series that features research, integrated assessment, and science transfer projects funded by the NERRS Science Collaborative. Webinars also feature projects from Science Collaborative team members as they engage the reserve system. We'll be taking a break from the webinar series for the month of August, but please join us for our upcoming panel webinar that will feature projects that are finding creative and diverse ways to foster climate resilience in different regions. That is from 3 to 4 p.m. Monday, September 9th, 2019, with panelists Lisa Auermuller, Sabrina Bentz, Philip Orton, and Stuart Siegel, with moderator Susie Moser. More details will come over the next week. That webinar is available on our website to register for ahead of time if you are interested. Before we get started, I'd like to ask a couple poll questions to get a sense of your familiarity with the NERRS and Science Collaborative. Please respond when you see the poll at your screen. This is pretty interesting for us. Usually we don't get a lot of people who haven't heard of the NERRS before, so we're very excited to have you. Welcome. We hope you'll stick around. We have one more poll question we want to launch as well before we get started, so we'll go ahead and launch that one as well. Got a nice diverse breakdown today. Lots of government folks, always happy to have you, and lots of university people, which I think probably makes sense for the subject matter at hand today. So we're very excited to get in the presentation. We'll keep moving. Those of you who are new to the NERRS and Science Collaborative, National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a NOAA program in collaboration with a local place-based partner, either a state agency, university, or nonprofit. It's a network of 29 unique research reserves. Each reserve is protected for long-term research, water quality monitoring, education, and coastal stewardship. You can see the 29 reserves on the map in front of you. Its mission is to practice and promote stewardship of coasts and estuaries through innovative research, education, and training using a place-based system of protected areas. Reserves pursue their mission in a highly collaborative way, both with one another and with public, private, and community organizations at various levels. The Science Collaborative is one of the research funding mechanisms for the NERRS. It's currently housed in the University of Michigan through a cooperative agreement with NOAA. The research it supports is distinctive in a few ways. Projects support reserve management needs, and they do this through highly collaborative research, integrating the end users of the research into the research process itself to produce outcome-oriented products, with the goal being research uptake and use. Just as the reserve system stresses engagement, we do so through our webinars. Matt and Brita welcome your questions. You can send your questions via the questions box and the speakers will answer them. You can also raise your hand to get our attention if you have a question or you want to ask your question yourself. We'll have time for a Q&A period at the end, and our speakers have been kind enough to agree today to stay a bit past the end of the webinar to answer any additional questions if you have them. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Matt McCarthy is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of South Florida's College of Marine Science. He specializes in remote sensing and large-scale coastal mapping with supercomputing technologies and advanced image processing techniques. He has applied remote sensing methods to study a variety of issues, including mangroves, seagrasses, coral reefs, coastal geomorphology, sea level rise, aquaculture, and public health. Dr. Brita Jessen is the research manager at the Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. She specializes in ecosystem ecology of coastal wetlands. As the research team lead, Dr. Jessen supports long-term monitoring programs related to water quality, sea level rise, habitat change, and wildlife, and works across departments to facilitate the translation of current research into management and policy. Thank you both for being with us today. Brita will be starting us off, so I'll turn the floor over to you now.
Thanks, Nick, and good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for taking the time to be here today. As Nick said, my name is Brita Jessen. I'm the research coordinator for Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. Some of my duties are to enable our in-house monitoring programs and support visiting scientists and subject experts for project-based work. Oh, Nick, could you click over to the next slide, please? Great, thanks. And then do I have controls?
Yep, you might need to click on the actual presentation screen. You should have control though.
Thank you. The work that Matt and I are going to discuss today is a great example of how these two objectives, our monitoring work and the visiting scientist work, blend together, where Matt's work is strongly informed by our monitoring, and in turn, this project has bolstered our efforts to capture and respond to climate change. Today, I will give an overview of the Rookery Bay Reserve and our management needs, and then pass the reins over to Matt, who will showcase the heart and soul of this project. This outline slide is actually here as an opportunity for you to place your mind at Rookery Bay without being subjected to loads of mosquitoes. From this aerial photo, you can see how our coastal fringe habitat is dominated by mangrove vegetation and has a lot of geological complexity. It is also very, very flat. Inches of elevation change will have a significant role on the habitat type, which leads to a mosaic of complex and diverse habitat behind the mangroves that can be easily altered by environmental drivers. So we are located in Southwest Florida, and Rookery Bay Reserve encompasses 110,000 acres. The county in which we sit, called Collier County, is approximately twice the size of Rhode Island. Our reserve manages 40% of the coastline for Collier County. On the right-hand map, you can see the reserve outlined in yellow and a striking contrast between adjacent regions. The northern half of the reserve is bounded by urban landscapes of Naples and Marco Island. The southern half of our reserve is the 10,000 Islands region, which is the westernmost extent of the Everglades. The large, colorful areas represent land conservation under different state and federal agencies. We work closely with these partners as we promote research-based management. For example, the managed lands of our closest partners, Collier Seminole State Park in orange and the 10,000 Islands National Wildlife Refuge in yellow, also had their managed lands mapped through this project today. So we'll go to the next one. Whoa, our font got all messed up. That's too bad. I'm sorry. Well, if you could read our mission and vision statements, the purpose of Rookery Bay Reserve is to serve local communities by promoting and translating science. Next slide. I'm sorry, everyone. It looks like our font didn't translate from one computer to the next. We'll just keep going. So as part of the network of 29 reserves across the country, our core programs include research, education, stewardship, also known as resource management, and the coastal training program, which played a critical role in this project. Rookery Bay's coastal training program is headed by Jessica McIntosh. This program provides critical and increasingly necessary links between scientists and stakeholders and helps us for each stage of project development, whether we are developing proposals, facilitating collaborative meetings, or creating meaningful outputs for end users. In my experience, this program is one of the most important strengths of the reserve system. Another great strength of our system is what's called the System-Wide Monitoring Program, or SWAMP. This program is standardized across the 29 reserves, all of which conduct water quality, weather, and habitat monitoring. Our most recent component is the Sentinel Site program developed by NOAA, which is currently examining vegetation and elevation change in relationship with sea level rise. The data for all of this work is available at NERRSdata.org, the link that's up there, for you to be able to access at any time and any place. At Rookery Bay, we supplement this monitoring work with robust wildlife monitoring and stewardship. But for today, we're going to focus on habitat. Okay. Our initial habitat map was initiated in 2013 in partnership with Mike Berry at the Institute for Regional Conservation. It was based on extensive field observations, historic and current aerial photography, and as I've been told, grueling hand digitization. We used the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan Classification System, or CERP classification. This gave us 117 vegetation types within the reserve. Overall, this effort took around 5 years to fully complete. So the map that you see on the right-hand panel of the slide does not do justice to the effort. And I strongly recommend any of you interested to visit the website that I have listed here. And we have a GIS mapping section where you can actually look at the interactive map and other features of the GIS program here. I think we're up for a, okay. So as you can imagine, during the multi-year time frame of this mapping effort, there is ongoing habitat change. Some chronic and acute drivers of change are listed here, and probably many of these are familiar to you depending on your region. A significant recent change was Hurricane Irma, whose eyewall went straight over the reserve on September 10th, 2018 as a Category 3 storm. Maximum sustained wind speeds were around 140 miles per hour. We kept 3 out of our 5 water quality monitoring stations running during the storm, and we measured approximately 3 meters of storm surge, which was thankfully less than predicted. This storm surge deposited a thick layer of marine sediment through sections of the backwaters and up into mangroves, which will be relevant to the results that we see from Matt's work later on. And if you can see the color differences in these images, you can look at the extent of canopy loss in the mid-region of our reserve. For those of you who are not familiar with mangrove systems, we should probably take a moment to explain that mangroves in subtropical regions are adapted to large storm events and typically recover within 10 to 20 years, given an appropriate environmental conditions. However, mangrove wetlands at Rookery Bay and globally have been increasingly altered due to land use and watershed modifications and other exacerbating conditions such as sea level rise. So now we are in an anthropic era where recovery and resilience may not follow the same patterns as before. This is where resource managers depend on rapid information about the extent of change, the drivers of change, and the potential for recovery. And now I'm going to turn this over to Matt, who will talk about his expertise and how his efforts helped Rookery Bay with this need for knowledge.
Thanks, Brita. And as Nick mentioned, I'm a postdoc at the University of South Florida and co-PI on this project with my advisor, Professor Frank Mueller-Carter, who is unfortunately traveling right now. Now, I finished my PhD in Frank's lab in 2017 using high-resolution imagery to map coastal wetlands, and in 2018 published a paper describing rapid coastal hardwood forest decline in Florida's Big Bend region. Now, that data for that work ended in 2017 before Hurricane Irma, so when I saw an opportunity to partner with Rookery Bay, where Irma made landfall, to map and assess the damage caused by it, I reached out to Brita and we put together the following project goals. First, mapping land and aquatic habitats for the years 2010, 13, 16, 17, and 18. Those years were chosen to coincide with the existing 2010 Rookery Bay baseline map, and because the imagery that we are using for this project began in 2009 and then in 2013 for our Landsat sensor. We then mapped 2016, 17, and 18 in order to derive a baseline change assessment and then a post-Irma assessment, followed by a Irma recovery assessment, which we'll get into soon. That then allowed us to detect change location and then assess the areal extent change from one class to another. We then attempt to attribute changes to various environmental and anthropogenic drivers. And finally, we're sharing the information with regional resource managers through facilitated meetings like this webinar and disseminating the map products freely at the end of this project. Now, I'll go into more detail on the data in a few minutes, but I just want to summarize them here. We used high-resolution commercial Worldview 2 satellite imagery, as well as medium-resolution freely available Landsat imagery. We attempted to do three-dimensional mapping with LiDAR data, but unfortunately the data collected from 2018 has, as of this morning, still not been released, so we have not yet been able to complete that, but we're hoping in the next month we may be able to. And as Brita mentioned, we partnered again with Mike Berry for field surveys. Now, throughout this work, we've been engaging in a collaborative process, beginning with a kickoff meeting in September of 2017. September 2018, when we introduced our stakeholders, as you can see in the photograph on the right, to the project and methods, as well as management applications of habitat change maps. We then got feedback from those stakeholders who shared their management issues and how they might use the information from this project, the maps, and the change detection results. And in the ensuing year, we also held 3 web-based meetings where we engaged again with stakeholders, iteratively going over preliminary maps and assessing feedback from our stakeholders on where maps were correct or incorrect. This allowed us to then follow up with additional field work where we could verify indeed what our local experts were telling us as far as which areas of the preliminary maps were correct and which areas needed revision. We were then able to recursively produce these maps and improve their accuracy based both on field survey data as well as local expert knowledge. Now, wetland classification and wetland mapping in general is really nothing new. It's been done for decades using a variety of methods and data sources. One of the primary challenges with mapping wetlands is accurately identifying wetland vegetation and distinguishing it from adjacent non-wetland vegetation. So for example, identifying a mangrove forest, which may be only several meters away from upland pine or oak forest, for example. Now, what Brita mentioned earlier was that the existing 2010 Rookery Bay baseline maps were hand digitized. And the way that that's often done is by using an aerial photograph like the image you see on the right. These have very high resolution, on the order of 1 foot or so, and enable one to zoom in and identify individual tree canopies. And what an analyst does is looks at this image and digitizes the areas believed to be one habitat or another, generally using some kind of ground truth or reference data. But as you can see, even looking at resolution of this scale, it's still relatively difficult to determine which of these trees belong to one class or another, especially when digging down into very fine detail hierarchical classes. Another issue with aerial imagery is that it is sparsely collected based on funding available at the time and mission targets, as opposed to satellite imagery, which we use for this project, that is collected continually, essentially every moment of every day, as satellites orbit the Earth several hundred miles above us, collecting imagery as they go. However, there's a trade-off between different satellite sensors and as compared with aerial photographs. As you can see in the images on the bottom here, we have 2 satellite images shown at the exact same scale. And as you can see, the image on the left is much fuzzier or pixelated. That image on the left is from Landsat, which has 30 meter spatial resolution, as opposed to the image on the right, which is from the Worldview 2 satellite, which has 2 meter resolution. The difference being that a 30 meter pixel is actually 30 meters by 30 meters, meaning each pixel covers 900 square meters, whereas a Worldview pixel covers 4 square meters. Obviously, you're able to see much greater detail and map more precisely with high resolution imagery. And the benefit of using satellite images over aerial photography, in addition to the repeat acquisition, is that you can use digital mapping methods by exploiting the digital data contained within each pixel. Now, one of the reasons I got into wetland mapping initially was because I was looking at drivers of water quality events in estuaries around the Gulf of Mexico. And in doing so, I evaluated multiple land mapping products, particularly wetland mapping products, and I found substantial inconsistencies. So if we zoom into an area here in Tampa Bay at Fort DeSoto State Park, we can see in red wetlands as mapped by NOAA's Coastal Change Analysis Program on the left, the Southwest Florida Water Management District in the center, and the National Wetland Inventory on the right. Now, these maps are from 2009, 10, and 11, and yet the identified wetlands are substantially different. The reason that is because the data and methods used to map wetlands, as well as the definition of wetlands, varies from one mapping program to the other. So for this project, we wanted to sort of standardize our mapping protocol by defining wetlands, or in this case, mangroves, as red, white, and black mangroves, as well as buttonwood. And we use the digital data so that we could replicate these methods and use software programs that allow us to exploit computational resources. So here's a diagram of our workflow that began with 92 Worldview 2 images. These were processed using the USF CERC High Performance Computing Cluster, which is essentially 4,000 computers strung together such that each separate image is processed on a separate computer. The computing protocol is fully automated and uses a combination of Python and MATLAB code, although we are also in the process now of porting all of it to Python, so it will soon be all open source. The two-step process shown here calibrates each image and then performs a series of calculations and decisions on a total of about 500 million data points per image. And here's a fun fact for you. A few years ago, I almost broke the USF supercomputer by running too many of these images at once. But that's all water under the bridge now, and they're definitely not furious at me anymore. So the automated mapping code then spits out a classified map from each image, which I then stitch together using ArcGIS to make a cohesive mosaic for each time period, thereby resulting in a complete classified map. At the same time that I was working on this, Mike Berry braved the Rookery Bay wilderness to collect field data that were used to validate the appropriate map and compute accuracy. The Landsat images were processed through similar steps, but using a regular PC with a software program called NV that contains existing codes that easily calibrate and map the image with a machine learning classifier called Support Vector Machine to output a classified map for each time period. Now, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to go more in depth with these methods, but if anyone has questions at the end, please feel free to ask them. We're also publishing this work, of course, and we're going to be generating a protocol that explains how one might be able to replicate the methods for Worldview 2 and Landsat mapping. As we mentioned, Mike Berry conducted a field survey from September to November of 2018, about a year after Irma passed in September of 2017. He collected a total of 992 points throughout the reserve, and we then mapped our habitats to the following target classes: soil, degraded mangrove, healthy mangrove, upland, and water. Now, degraded mangrove is kind of a broad term. It refers to what we saw in the field, including defoliated mangrove, which has a very similar signature as existing marsh. So in the following maps, you're going to see some maps saying degraded mangrove and some saying marsh. They're representing the same thing. So this figure then is showing you the geographic coverage of the Worldview maps. Now, as you'll notice, not every map from Worldview covers the entire reserve. Now, that's unfortunate, and it's the result of the simple fact that Worldview images cover a relatively small area per image. So as I mentioned, we mapped 92 images, and we had to use that many images in order to get the size of coverage that we have here. I'll come back to these maps individually in a moment. I just wanted to show what the Worldview 2 coverage looks like, as compared with the Landsat geographic coverage, which is substantially better, And that's because of that trade-off we saw a moment ago with coarser spatial resolution. Although Landsat has a 30-meter resolution as opposed to a 2-meter resolution, each Landsat image covers an area orders of magnitude larger than a single Worldview image. And as a result, we're able to map the entire Rookery Bay Reserve with a single image at a time. And so we could get each one of these maps using a total of 6 images, whereas again with the Worldview maps, we used a total of 92 images. So now, first thing I want to talk about is the accuracy assessment, which was conducted on the Worldview November 2018 image. Now we're only able to statistically assess the accuracy on this image because it coincides with the period during which the points were collected. The results from Mike Berry's field survey found that our soil was identified at 95% accuracy, degraded mangrove was 56%, healthy mangrove 78%, upland 68%, water 100%, and the overall accuracy was 82%. Now, while I have this image up, I want to point out that you'll see some blotchy patches of yellow and orange. You might be able to see my cursor as I move over it. And you'll see some of these throughout the following images, and they represent clouds. Unfortunately, cloud cover is a common problem in remote sensing mapping. And so they confound the image, but essentially what we're going to do is clip those out of the final image products. So now I want to show a few side-by-side Worldview and Landsat maps for the corresponding period as a comparison of what the maps are able to indicate. So on the left, we have Worldview from 2016, February of 2016, and on the right is May of 2016. So essentially the springtime in 2016. Of course, Worldview doesn't cover the same area as Landsat, unfortunately. But what you'll also notice is the Worldview image on the left contains a lot more of that red habitat class. That's representing healthy mangrove vegetation. The Landsat image on the right is also showing healthy mangrove in red, but there is substantially less of it. And so there seems to be a misclassification between mangrove vegetation and marsh vegetation, which again in a moment is going to represent degraded mangroves. And so unfortunately we were not able to assess the accuracy of the Landsat maps because we didn't have one corresponding to the same time as the field survey. The images you see now are from spring and early summer of 2017. So this is sort of the pre-Irma maps. Now each of these maps looks very similar to the map I just showed you a moment ago because there's very little change throughout the reserve, especially at the scale we're viewing it right now. And so again, you see primarily that red healthy mangrove throughout the reserve in both images, although a bit more marsh in the image on the right from Landsat. So now I'm going to flip to the post-Irma map and we'll see how the habitats changed. As you can see, that red in each of the images was converted to green, which represents the change from healthy mangrove to degraded mangrove, also called here as marsh. So that's indicating areas of healthy mangrove that were generally defoliated. So there are still mangrove stands there, but they were generally defoliated, they lost their leaves. And now what the images are picking up is a combination of the remaining leaf cover as well as the tree trunks and branches themselves. So those now are showing up again as marsh vegetation, which we know to be degraded mangrove. But we're able to go a bit further in time now and look at early 2018, so about 5 or 6 months after Hurricane Irma. Unfortunately, the Worldview image doesn't cover the entire area, but we can see a corroboration between Worldview and Landsat showing that some areas here have changed now either to a little bit more red, indicating recovery, or some areas that have converted now from red to green to orange, orange representing soil. And so we're going to delve more into that in a minute, but what that essentially means is that those areas that were degraded then further died, such that now the images are seeing down to the ground. In other words, the canopy is completely gone and the images are able to pick up the soil below them. So I want to focus for a few moments now on the Worldview images specifically, looking here at how Hurricane Irma damaged the reserve. So we saw both of these maps a moment ago. Now we have them side by side with March to July of 2017, or pre-Irma on the left, post-Irma on the right. And again, you can see here clearly where all of the red was converted now to that degraded mangrove or marsh throughout the reserve. Now I'm going to move the image on the right over to the left and show on the right the November 2018 image. So this is more than a year after Irma on the right, whereas the left image now is still the post-Irma results. So by comparing these maps, we can now see an assessment of which areas recovered. Unfortunately, again, you have some of the blotches on the right indicating cloud cover, as well as some on the top right of the image on the left. But we can see here much of the reserve did indeed recover. A lot of the areas that are green on the left came back to that healthy mangrove red. But if we zoom into one specific area, we can see the post-Irma image on the top, which is about 3 months after Irma, compared with the image on the bottom, which is 5 to 6 months after Irma. This is the Worldview 2-meter data. And we can see the areas that converted here from top to bottom, going from green to red, are areas where mangrove was degraded by Irma but then recovered. The areas that are green in the top and changed to orange or yellow in the bottom are areas where that degraded mangrove essentially died off, and now the image is picking up the soil beneath it. And this is one way we're able to assess these areas to see which areas changed following Irma from worse to better, or essentially degraded to dead. If we compare these results with the Landsat images, we can see again that some areas recovered, but we do not see the same soil signature here. And this is likely due to the resolution of the Landsat imagery. The coarser 30-meter resolution of the Landsat imagery makes it harder for the satellite to pick up the signal of the ground underneath the the trees of the mangroves that are maybe partially foliated, have some foliage on them, or even just are completely defoliated but may have existing trunks and branches that are confounding the signal and preventing the Landsat from picking up that soil signature below, and still considering these areas to be simply degraded mangrove and not dead mangrove. So that's one of the advantages of the Worldview imagery. We can get that finer precision and identify specifically which areas change from what to what more precisely. Now, the next thing we did after creating these maps was simply subtract one map from another to assess change. So in the next few maps, I'll be showing you areas that did not change in black and areas that did change in a variety of colors that'll be listed. This map is showing you the sort of baseline change from 2016 to 2017. And essentially, there's very little color throughout the image. I included blue in there to kind of highlight the areas that are land versus water, but blue does not indicate change. Essentially, there's very little change going on from 2016 to 2017. If we move now, that top should, instead of saying baseline, that should say 2017 to 2018. This is the Irma effects slide, or the Irma effects change. And we can see here in bright green where healthy mangrove was converted to degraded mangrove for a total of 13.8 square kilometers. Now I'm zoomed into this section of the reserve and I've clipped out everything else because this section, the sort of sliver of the reserve, represents the area that was consistently mapped in the high resolution Worldview 2 imagery from 2016, 17, and 18. So 13.8, or about 13% of the reserve, at least in this snapshot area of it, was converted from healthy to degraded mangrove by Hurricane Irma. If we then look at the recovery from December 2017 to November of 2018, we see about 10 square kilometers of degraded mangrove rebounded, recovered to a healthy mangrove, 10 square kilometers. But then about 1.5 square kilometers of degraded mangrove appears to have completely died off because it is now coming up as soil, which should suggest that that area is now considered dead. One area of mangrove loss that we went out and visited specifically showed up in our change detection images as having more water. which is a bit unusual. So we went out in the field with Mike Berry, Jill Schmidt, and Tyler Murray, our other team member. We were able to snap this photograph of an area that is not right along the edge of an island. It's actually somewhat toward the center. And this is an area where black mangroves died off before Hurricane Irma. And it appears that what happened is that as a result of rising sea levels in this area, this relatively lower lying area, which is still exposed to tidal variations, is retaining more water than it used to. And because it's retaining water, it has slowly killed off the otherwise healthy black mangroves that used to exist here. Now, I don't have time to go into depth on sea level rise, but I did want to make note, we did assess Naples sea level rise rates. The long-term rate for this area from 1966 to 2017 is 3 millimeters per year, which agrees with the global average. From 2010 to 2017, 2000 to 2017, that rate increased to 7 millimeters per year, more than doubling. And from 2010 to 2017, that rate increased again to 13 millimeters per year. So this area is undergoing rapid sea level rise, and it's accelerating. And we believe that it's affecting some of these areas inland, in addition to and compounding the impacts of Hurricane Irma. So we've now got an activity for you to please type in your responses. We wanted to allow you to answer these questions in a longer form. So if you could please type into the chat box your answers to the following questions. Would you be interested in this method of habitat change analysis for your system or study area? And do you have existing ground truth information to train and use satellite-based data? So I'll give you a moment to answer that. Now feel free to keep answering. I'm going to move on now. I'm going to try to move on now. Okay, so to sort of wrap up, we then use these change detection results to evaluate drivers of these losses. Now, some of the results of our die-off mangroves appear to corroborate results published earlier this year by Radaba et al., who went out in the field 2 to 3 months after Irma and then again 9 months after Irma and found that mortality of mangroves actually increased in the larger trees from 11% to 20%. Now they attributed this loss, this sort of delayed loss, to the measured 10 centimeters or more of marl overwash, which was brought up from the bottom of the local waterways onto the mangrove roots by the hurricane's storm surge. That marl then effectively starved the mangroves of oxygen and resulted in this delayed mortality. We also, however, noted areas of recovery. And as Radaba also noted, there was about 60% canopy cover 3 to 9 months following Irma. And what that means is that more sunlight was able to reach through the otherwise thick canopy of the mangroves here to the saplings and seedlings below, which allowed them, as we observed here in the photograph on the right in May of this year, just 2 months ago, allowed these saplings to begin growing in areas where they may not have been able to grow had Hurricane Irma not come through. So this is an area we observed of positive results, positive recovery. Implications of this work that may relate to you include the fact that these methods are replicable. Landsat data, as we mentioned, is freely available. Any one of you right now can download it for yourself and map your own study area. Worldview imagery is commercially available. We have a partnership with some providers here at USF, and we would be more than happy to discuss collaborative projects with anyone listening here. We also, again, as I mentioned, intend to publish this work and also produce a protocol that will hopefully allow anyone else to replicate these results to other study areas and to do more work in Rookery Bay in the future to monitor additional change. I also want to point out that in addition to the Worldview satellite sensor, there's now a Worldview 3 satellite sensor that will allow us to fill in some of the gaps that I mentioned earlier. That data is available from 2009 to the present, so there's now a decade's worth of data available to do time series work with it. Finally, we are pursuing ways to use this data for modeling purposes, to use the high-resolution land cover maps and iterative mapping applications to model future ecosystem change. And we'd be happy to discuss with anyone here potential collaborations and the way that we might be able to use this data for such purposes. And lastly, I want to mention an ongoing project conducted by myself and my co-PI, Frank Mueller-Karger. We have an NSF project we're 1 year into of 3 years. And we're actually using this Worldview imagery to map habitats for the entire Gulf of Mexico coast, essentially from Brownsville, Texas, all the way over to Miami, Florida. That will be from the coast to 50 kilometers inland at 2-meter resolution. The data will also incorporate LiDAR data for 3-dimensional analysis, so we anticipate having 2-meter 3-dimensional maps for the entire Gulf Coast within the next 2 years. Now, I know that some of the folks listening here have study areas that are going to be covered by these maps, and so if anyone is interested in partnering with us to share data, especially in the interest of sharing ground truth data that'll help us evaluate the accuracy, help us train our maps to better map your area, we would be more than happy to partner with you. Please reach out and contact me. And with that, I think I'll pass it back over to Brita to wrap up with some other results of this project.
Thanks for that, Matt. And I just wanted to add on for an additional implication of Matt's work. We have a sister National Estuarine Research Reserve on the south coast of Puerto Rico called Jobos Bay NERR, and they were hit with Hurricane Maria approximately one week after Hurricane Irma came to southwest Florida. So Jobos Bay and Rookery Bay recently co-wrote a science capacity proposal together, again through the Science Collaborative, where we were able to participate in cross-site exchanges between our two reserves. And Matt in the blue hat was able to come down with us. As you can all see, we had a really rotten time. And we were able to go down and assess what the recovery was like for a system in Puerto Rico that is very similar in natural resources, context, and some similarities and some differences in social economic context. And then the same switch happened with Jobos Bay coming to visit Rookery Bay. And among the experts that we had in the room, we also had stakeholders involved. And our big hope is that we'll be able to take Matt's work for the Rookery Bay Reserve and apply it to Jobos Bay Reserve to look at the impacts of both Hurricanes Maria and Irma and how the two systems recover. So I just wanted to share that with everyone on how we're taking the information that we have already and applying it to other reserves in our system. And I think that concludes our webinar for today. I'm going to click to the next slide. And Nick, I'll hand it back to you for follow-up questions.
Great, thanks guys. Just a quick reminder, if we can take questions either through the GoToWebinar console, the same way you typed in your responses to their first question. You can also raise your hand if you'd like us to unmute you, and you can ask your question yourself. We do have a couple questions that were popping up towards the end of the presentation already. One of them was asking if there's any plans to expand spoke hub mapping work coverage. I think that was probably that.
Yeah, to expand the spoke hub mapping. Well, we're tackling the entire Gulf of Mexico coastline has been a challenge in and of itself. We're dealing with several dozen terabytes of data and approximately 200,000 Worldview images. So I think tackling that and doing so in a way that overlaps with existing LiDAR data so that we can do the 3-dimensional maps is going to be our priority for the next 2 years. But the ultimate goal is to map the entire coastal US and beyond. So essentially, we will eventually be interested in moving this work elsewhere. But if anyone specifically would like to partner with us in the meantime, I'm sure we could discuss ways that we could collaborate and expand that in areas that might need it sooner or might have some data that could help us out.
I'll also quickly say that as part of the exit survey at the end of the webinar, we've included a question that allows you to say whether or not you're interested in any sort of follow-up work or collaboration work. So look for that survey at the close of the webinar. It'll also be emailed out around this time tomorrow as well. I think it's an automatic reminder that goes out through the GoToWebinar system, so it'll be from the same email address that you saw your registration form with, and you can indicate your interest that way via the exit survey. Another question coming in from the chat. Someone is asking, how do we get a hold of Worldview images in Lee County?
Let's see. So you are able to purchase imagery, if you like, through the company Digital Globe. Digital Globe is the company that owns Worldview 2 and Worldview 3 imagery. So if you'd like to purchase it, you're welcome to do so through their website. Otherwise, if you'd like to collaborate with USF, myself, or anyone else with a license, which generally is granted to university and government agencies so long as they have a NASA or NSF grant, you could reach out again to us or look for anyone else who has that data. There are a number of institutions who have that kind of license. Just to sort of toot our own horn for a minute, one of the issues with this data is that it is very large, and it's necessary to have appropriate data storage and management capacity, and that's one of the strengths that we have here at the University of South Florida. So please reach out to me. I don't see our contact information available. I can just say right now my email is mjm, as in Matt James McCarthy, 8@mail.usf.edu. That's mjm8@mail.usf.edu.
I think Lynn's going to go ahead and post those into the chat for everybody as well. They are available on our website as well for those who have been asking. It's on the project page for this project. I see a couple more questions rolling in. Somebody real quick is just asking you if you can repeat the sea level rise figures.
Sure. From 1966 to 2017, which is the extent of the Naples record, we found the mean sea level rise to be 3 millimeters per year. From 2000 to 2017, 7 millimeters per year. From 2010 to 2017, 13 millimeters per year. I should point out, of course, that those 2000 and 2010 time points are arbitrary. We simply chose arbitrary time points, 2000, 2010, for nominal purposes. But if you choose different times, you might get slightly different results.
Got another question here. Let me see if I can kind of simplify the question a bit so I'm not reading you a longer sentence here. Without historic data dating back a few decades, to what extent could climate change and the ensuing sea level rise be implicated for net mangrove loss?
Well, that's a great question. We always want to have more data, and the longer data record we can have, the better assessment we can have in attributing loss. So what we could do is expand this project or other projects using the Landsat time series, which actually dates back to 1972, and do a kind of coarser but still valid assessment of mangrove change over time. So with that said, this project was sort of a short-term mapping and change assessment. A longer-term project would really be beyond the scope of this work. Certainly something we're interested in. There has been a number of publications on mangrove change throughout Southwest Florida, especially the Everglades, using longer time series imagery, especially aerial imagery from the 1940s and before that. With that said, it's absolutely correct that we need to say that without a longer term baseline, it is difficult to attribute any changes we're seeing. However, we feel comfortable attributing the Irma changes, of course, because they were driven by an acute event. And by using the baseline 2010 to 2016, we can assess relative change and attempt to attribute it to drivers for which we have data, including sea level. We have other environmental data that we'll be evaluating as well. We didn't have time to discuss it here. And during one of our field visits, I should also point out that we learned about some ongoing restoration efforts. And some of those efforts included the creation of swales in culverts to help direct water either out of areas that are now impounded or into areas through tidal exchange. And those areas are difficult to identify using remote sensing imagery. And so having that local expert knowledge really helps us attribute some of the more localized changes.
Yeah. Do you guys have any idea when the final project report might be expected?
We'll be wrapping up at the end of August, and so we expect to have that report done within 60 days from then. We currently have one manuscript ready for publication, another manuscript is coming out, so we hope to have both of those submitted by the end of this year. So the report should be done in the next 2 to 3 months. Manuscripts and the protocol explaining the method should be done again by the end of this year.
There were a few poll questions that we didn't get to earlier because we weren't sure whether or not the timing was going to work out. So while we've got everybody, we'd love to gather some audience feedback. I know Matt and Brita were interested in kind of polling the audience on their input for some of these questions. So I'll go ahead and launch one of these while we're waiting for more questions to roll in. I see a few coming in already, but we'll go ahead and launch this anyway. This one was earlier in the presentation relating to management issues. See another question here asking if online access to this is recorded for later review. We do post our Science Collaborative webinars on our Science Collaborative YouTube channel. We post them on our website as well. It'll link directly to the YouTube channel, but you can expect that within a few days of the webinar ending. Awesome. Matt, you and Britt are able to see these, correct, on your console?
Yes.
Yeah. So do you have any comments on any of these figures?
Yeah. Mapping invasive species has been a hot topic in recent years. It's something that I'm particularly interested in, especially mapping things like Melaleuca and Brazilian pepper in Florida. Climate resilience, adaptation, vulnerability. Yeah, that's another area of concern recently, especially with hardened shorelines and modeling which areas would be appropriate for hardened shorelines. I've been involved in some research on that. And really all of these seem to be getting more or less equal response, and I'm certainly interested in pursuing research into each one of these. So please, if you think that any of this work would be interested, please reach out to me. We're currently working on some restoration needs projects. I've done some work with the Fish and Wildlife Institute of Florida and mapping wetlands in Tampa Bay in an effort to try and standardize the mapping products. And that was at the watershed scale where we mapped 6,500 square kilometers in under 24 hours. So this kind of work is really easily replicable as long as we have some partnership and some field data that can help us validate those maps. So I can't emphasize enough, but we are absolutely open to more collaboration, and we really have the data in-house that we could start working very soon on new projects.
This question kind of follows on those comments you were just making. We'll go ahead and launch this poll as well. This is a multiple select, so you can pick anything that applies for this one. anybody who's still in the audience and wants to weigh in on this one. What other types of data would you want to incorporate with habitat change mapping? Okay, let's go ahead and close this poll and we'll share the results here. Is a clear winner.
Vulnerability assessments, yeah, that's very important these days.
There's an interesting comment at the last one, the last poll here, someone typed in right at the end. They said they should also include genetic variability in the answer among the important topics for that previous poll question.
Yeah, as far as the economic value goes, there was a webinar last month by Sarah Mason and Duke University discussing modeling, how to model ecosystem values. And so that's an area of research that we're hoping to get more involved in by using these habitat maps at such high resolution and such repeat frequency to help tune those models and evaluate ecosystem valuation, which is a strong driver in communicating science to the public. Putting ecosystem services in dollar amounts goes a long way towards communicating the value and getting public interest in some of these restoration efforts.
Someone has their hand raised. Okay, so looks like we've got a question from the audience. I'll go ahead and okay, Melissa, you're on the line. Hear us okay? Hit her again. I guess we had some technical issues there. Let's see, Dorothy Geyer has a question as well. Go ahead and unmute you. No, okay.
Dorothy, did you have a question you wanted to verbalize?
No, okay, suppose not. Dorothy, if you do want to ask your question and it's just an audio issue, you can go ahead and type it in and we'll reiterate it for you. In the meantime, we're just about at the top of the hour here. It looks like the questions are still being typed into chat and a few are starting to slow down. We do have one more poll question that we'd love to ask since we have you all here. And then we will go ahead and adjourn. And there's that last question, I believe. Okay, there's our final poll results.
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, it makes sense for marsh to be a target habitat. There's a lot of blue carbon research, among other research, going on in marshes these days, and mangroves only extend so far. What I'd say to that is that the algorithms that we developed to do this mapping work are tuned right now to primarily Gulf Florida habitats, so mangroves, but to some extent marsh as well. We'd like to expand into the East Coast of the coterminous United States, and so that would contain a lot of marsh as well. And we're very interested in partnering with folks who could provide us with some local expert knowledge and some ground truth data to help us map marsh. Of course, we're always interested in upland forest. We have to distinguish upland forest from mangroves. So we'll be doing that for the NSF project as well. As far as mud flats go, we actually did incorporate that into the Rookery Bay work. I didn't really talk about it much today, but it is one of our habitats. And submerged aquatic vegetation was initially a target class for this project, but unfortunately the water quality in the reserve is so turbid that we weren't able to consistently map aquatic vegetation in any of the images. It was just consistently very turbid, and so that was disappointing. But we are working on other projects right now, including the NSF project, among others, where we are mapping submerged habitats, benthic habitats, including seagrass, and coral reefs, and we like to add oyster reefs. The problem with oyster reefs is that we have to have good ground truth data so that we can tune our algorithm to oyster reefs, which have a signal that's very similar to other habitats, and it's very difficult for someone to look at an image and identify which areas are oyster, which areas are not. So if anyone has that kind of data that can help us out and partner with us, please reach out. We're very interested in doing that.
Got a question and a comment here. One very emphatic comment that just says we need all the habitat types mapped. I think that's a stellar endorsement and interest in your work, so that's good to see. And then a question from the audience asking if the red tide had any effect on the mangroves.
I would not expect it to, but I'll let her.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. We didn't actually have that much issue with red tide in this region of the Southwest Coast. And for mapping all the habitats, what we've been learning about while working with Matt is this trade-off of getting these map products done efficiently and quickly to respond to the urgent need that we had after a major storm event versus the very careful and detailed work that we had for that more robust and detailed habitat map. So it really is a trade-off between that hand digitized map, which takes a lot of on-the-ground work and careful hand digitization, which will take several years to get done, versus the kind of rapid work that Matt's able to do. So from my point of view, as this dual role of a research coordinator and manager, I think we'll always try to integrate the two of these, probably always continue to update our habitat map maybe every 5 years, interspersed with this type of rapid response mapping that Matt's able to do. Because at the moment, I don't think we can distinguish habitats too much more than what he's able to do.
Thanks, Brita. That was great. We're just a little bit over the top of the hour, so I'll go ahead and do a formal adjourn now. We will be leaving the webinar open for a few minutes afterwards, so feel free to keep typing in your questions. We'll be sticking around on the line. If any questions you ask were not answered, they'll be included in the webinar brief. You can expect that in the next week or so after the webinar wraps up. The webinar briefs are just a written product that accompanies the webinar and has summary points that accompany the presentation slides and answers to the Q&A written out for your reading. Thank you to everyone that participated in the webinar today. Please keep an eye out for future webinar announcements. We have many interesting projects wrapping up over the coming months, so we'll be sharing their findings and lessons learned. Some panel webinars in development that will look across several projects, such as the climate adaptation one in September. Please also consider joining us and signing up for our Estuaries, webinar brief. Please consider joining us in September, as I said. Please consider signing up for the program updates and webinar announcements that accompany these webinars as well. That's available on our website at the URL listed right there. And we'll end with a big thank you to Matt and Brita for taking the time to be with us today and share some of their work with us, and for answering our questions and giving us a thoughtful presentation. So thank you, Matt, and thank you, Brita.
Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.